The sun was dying over Cedar Ridge, bleeding crimson across the endless sky, as it had done every evening since time began. Main Street stretched before Judge Samuel Whitfield's daughter like a dusty scar through the heart of town, lined with weathered storefronts and false-fronted buildings that promised more than they delivered. Elizabeth Whitfield stood at her bedroom window, watching the day surrender to dusk, her fingers pressed against the cool glass as if she could push through it and escape into that vast, burning horizon. Below, the evening ritual was beginning. Cowboys stumbled from the Silver Dollar Saloon, their spurs jangling discordant melodies against the wooden sidewalks. Somewhere a piano played a melancholy tune, its notes drifting up through the thick air like smoke from a dying fire. The wind had picked up, as it always did at this hour, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust, whispering secrets through the gaps in the buildings. Elizabeth turned from the window, her reflection catching in the mirror, pale skin made paler by the strict, high-necked dress her father insisted upon. Dark hair pulled back so tightly it made her temples ache. 23 years old, and she felt as weathered as the town itself, worn down by expectations and propriety. In the parlor below, she could hear her father's voice, deep and authoritative, discussing the week's sentences with Marshal Tom Hayes. Justice. He called it order. He preached. But Elizabeth had seen enough to know that justice in Cedar Ridge wore many faces, and not all of them were righteous. The sandstorm came without warning, as they often did in late September. One moment the evening was merely breezy, the next, a wall of dust rolled down from the northern hills like an avalanche of earth and sky. Elizabeth heard the shouts from the street, the scramble of boots on boards, the slam of shutters being pulled tight. She should have closed her own window, should have drawn the curtains and lit the lamps. But something held her there, watching as the world outside disappeared into a swirling veil of amber and brown. That's when she saw him. He emerged from the storm like something conjured from the dust itself, a tall figure leading a black horse, moving with purpose while others scattered for shelter. His duster coat whipped around him, and even from her window, Elizabeth could see the way he moved was different from the cowboys and merchants she knew. There was a controlled power in his stride, a wariness that spoke of hard miles and harder choices. The stranger paused directly beneath her window, looking up as if he could feel her gaze through the storm. For a moment that stretched like eternity, their eyes met. His face was obscured by the brim of his hat and the swirling dust, but his eyes, dark as midnight, burning with something she couldn't name, held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then chaos erupted. A gunshot cracked through the storm, followed by another. Men's voices rose in alarm. Elizabeth saw the stranger's hand move to his hip with practiced speed, saw the flash of metal. Then he was moving, pulling his horse into the narrow alley beside her father's house. More shots rang out, and through the dust, she could make out shapes running, the glint of badges. Without thinking, Elizabeth flew from her room, her feet barely touching the stairs. The house was in confusion. Her father shouting orders, the marshal calling for his men. In the chaos, no one noticed as she slipped through the kitchen and out the back door. The storm hit her like a physical blow, dust filling her mouth and nose, stinging her eyes. She stumbled forward, one hand against the wall to guide her, until she reached the old carriage house that hadn't been used in years. The door hung askew on its hinges, and she pushed through into the musty darkness. He was there. The stranger stood in the shadows, his gun drawn, listening to the sounds of pursuit outside. When Elizabeth entered, he spun toward her, and for a heartbeat, she stared down the barrel of his revolver. Then recognition flickered in those dark eyes, and he lowered the weapon. "You should go back inside, Miss—" His voice was low, roughened by dust and something else, exhaustion, perhaps, or pain. "You're hurt," she said, noticing now the dark stain spreading across his shirt. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Elizabeth could see the way he held himself, the careful breathing of someone trying not to show weakness. Outside, the voices were getting closer. "They'll find you here," she said. "Probably. There's another way out." Through the root cellar, it connects to the old mine shaft. He studied her for a long moment. Why would the judge's daughter help a wanted man? How did he know who she was? But then, everyone knew Judge Whitfield's daughter, the perfect lady, the exemplar of virtue, the caged bird who sang only when commanded. I don't know, she answered honestly. Maybe because I'm tired of watching my father hang men who steal bread while the real thieves walk free in silk suits. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or understanding. The shouting was closer now. Without another word, Elizabeth grabbed an old lantern from a shelf, struck a match with trembling fingers, and led him to the corner where wooden steps descended into darkness. The root cellar was cool and damp, filled with the ghosts of preserves and provisions long since used. Elizabeth's lantern threw wild shadows on the earthen walls as they moved through the narrow space. At the far end, barely visible, was the entrance to the tunnel, a relic from the town's mining days, before the silver played out and left Cedar Ridge to survive on cattle and stubbornness. "This leads to the hills," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Half a mile, maybe more." He paused at the tunnel entrance, turning back to her. In the lantern light, she could see his face clearly for the first time, sharp angles softened by a day's worth of stubble. A scar along his jawline that spoke of violence survived. But it was his eyes that held her, deep and dark and seeing too much. "What's your name?" she asked, surprising herself. "Does it matter?" "Everything matters." A smile touched his lips, there and gone like lightning. Jake Callahan. The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it, like confession, like trust, made something flutter in her chest. "Elizabeth," she offered in return. "I know who you are. Elizabeth Whitfield." He stepped closer, and she could smell leather and gunpowder and something wild, like wind over empty spaces. "You should go back now, before they realize you're gone." "Yes," she agreed, but didn't move. They stood there in the circle of lantern light, the storm raging above, the world shrinking to just this moment, just the space between them that seemed to hum with possibility. Elizabeth had lived her entire life by rules, her father's rules, society's rules, the endless rules that governed what a lady could and couldn't do. But here, in this buried place with a wanted man whose eyes promised adventures she'd only dreamed of, those rules seemed as insubstantial as dust. "1 hour," he said suddenly. "Give me 1 hour before you go back, so they can't say you returned too quickly." It was an excuse, and they both knew it. But Elizabeth nodded, set the lantern on an old crate, and sat down on a wooden box, her very proper dress pooling around her in the dirt. Jake leaned against the wall, favoring his wounded side, but his eyes never left her face. "Tell me," she said, "what it's like out there, beyond the town limits, beyond the rules." And he did, for 1 wild hour, while the storm raged and the world searched for him above. Jake Callahan painted pictures with words of vast spaces where the sky went on forever, of nights so clear you could read by starlight, of freedom that came with a price but was worth every cent. He told her of riding through painted deserts and sleeping under ancient stars, of rivers that cut through stone and mountains that scraped the belly of heaven. Elizabeth had never felt so awake, so aware of every breath, every heartbeat. When he spoke of sunrise over the canyons, she could see the light. When he described the wind through the high passes, she could feel it on her skin. This was living, she realized. Not the careful existence she'd maintained for 23 years, but this burning awareness of every moment. "Why are they after you?" she asked when he paused. His expression darkened. "Because I know things, because I won't bow down. Because in towns like this, the law isn't about justice, it's about power." She thought of her father, of his absolute certainty in right and wrong, his heavy gavel falling like the hammer of God. "He's not a bad man," she said quietly. "He believes in what he does." "Maybe, but believing doesn't make it right." The hour passed like minutes, like seconds, like a lifetime compressed into heartbeats. When Jake finally pushed away from the wall, Elizabeth felt something tear inside her chest. "I have to go," he said. "I know." He stepped toward the tunnel, then stopped, turned back. Before she could speak, before she could think, he was there, his hand cupping her face with surprising gentleness. "You're wasted in this town. Elizabeth Whitfield, you've got fire in you. Don't let them put it out." Then his lips were on hers, and Elizabeth's careful world exploded into sensation. The kiss was nothing like the chaste pecks she'd endured from suitable suitors. It was wild and desperate and alive, tasting of dust and danger and promises that couldn't be kept. Her hands found their way to his chest, feeling the heat of him through the rough fabric, the rapid beat of his heart matching her own. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes held regret and something else, a hunger that matched the ache building inside her. "Remember this," he said roughly. "When they try to tell you who you are, remember that you chose this. You chose to be brave." Then he was gone, disappearing into the tunnel's darkness, leaving Elizabeth alone with the lantern and the echo of her wild hour. She sat there until her breathing steadied, until the trembling stopped, until she could trust herself to return to the world above and pretend nothing had changed. But everything had changed. When Elizabeth finally emerged from the carriage house, the storm had passed, leaving the night clear and star-struck. The search parties were still out, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the distance. She slipped back into the house unnoticed, climbed the stairs to her room, and stood again at the window. Somewhere out there, Jake Callahan was riding toward freedom, carrying with him a piece of her heart she hadn't known she could give, and here she remained, the judge's daughter, trapped in propriety and expectations. But now she knew what lay beyond the window. Now she had tasted what it meant to live, if only for one wild hour. The stars watched, silent witnesses to her transformation, as Elizabeth Whitfield began the long wait for dawn, and for whatever came after. The morning after the storm dawned clear and merciless, as if the earth had been scoured clean of all its secrets. Elizabeth moved through her daily routines like a sleepwalker, pouring her father's coffee, straightening his papers, smiling at the appropriate moments during breakfast. But behind her composed facade, every nerve sang with the memory of rough hands and desperate kisses, of promises made in darkness, and a voice that painted freedom in shades of gold and crimson. "You seem distracted this morning, Elizabeth." Judge Samuel Whitfield's voice cut through her reverie like a blade through silk. He sat at the head of their dining table, imposing even in the simple act of reading his newspaper, his gray eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. "The storm kept me awake, Father." The lie came easily, tasting of dust and gunpowder. He folded the paper with precise movements. "Marshal Hayes tells me they lost the Outlaw in the storm. Disappeared like smoke." His eyes found hers, searching. "You didn't hear anything unusual last night, did you?" Elizabeth's hand remained steady as she refilled his cup. "Only the wind, Father. It was quite fierce." The judge studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. These men are dangerous. Elizabeth, lawless. They have no respect for the order we've worked so hard to establish." He stood, adjusting his vest with habitual precision. "I'll be at the courthouse all day. The Henderson trial begins this afternoon." After he left, Elizabeth sat alone in the dining room, staring at the sunlight streaming through lace curtains. The Henderson trial, she knew about it, of course. Old Jim Henderson, caught stealing medicine for his sick wife. Her father would sentence him to 6 months hard labor, maybe more. Justice. He would call it, "The law is the law." But Jake Callahan's words echoed in her mind. The law isn't about justice, it's about power. Days passed in a blur of careful normalcy. Elizabeth attended church socials, endured tea with the mayor's wife, smiled demurely at the young men her father deemed suitable. But at night, she lay awake remembering the weight of Jake's gaze, the heat of his kiss, the way he'd seen through her proper exterior to the fire beneath. Her dreams were filled with endless skies and the taste of freedom on desert wind. The first whispers came a week later. Martha Jennings mentioned it while shopping for fabric, bandits hitting the railway camps north of town. Sarah Morrison shared the news over tea. A stagecoach robbed near Devil's Canyon. But strangely, only the strongbox belonging to the mining company was taken, while the passengers were left unharmed with all their valuables. "They say the leader is tall," Sarah whispered, her eyes bright with the thrill of scandal. "Rides a black horse. Some say he's handsome as sin itself." Elizabeth's needle slipped, pricking her finger. A drop of blood welled up, crimson against pale skin. As autumn deepened, the stories multiplied. The Callahan gang, they called them, though some of the Mexican workers whispered, El Justiciero, the justice bringer. They robbed from the wealthy mine owners who paid their workers in company scrip. They hit the cattle barons who had driven small ranchers off their land. And always, mysteriously, money would appear where it was needed most. Medicine at the orphanage, food at the church poorhouse, debts paid off for struggling families. Judge Whitfield's response was swift and merciless. He tripled the bounty on Jake Callahan's head. He brought in hired guns from Kansas City, men with dead eyes and faster draws. He gave speeches about the cancer of lawlessness, about how mercy toward criminals was weakness that would destroy them all. Elizabeth watched her father transform from stern but fair to something harder, more brittle. The law became his religion, order his only god. He stayed late at the courthouse, poring over wanted posters and territorial statutes, searching for new ways to tighten his grip on Cedar Ridge. "You're too quiet lately," her father observed one evening as they dined alone. "Are you ill?" "No, Father." She met his gaze steadily. "I've simply been thinking." "About what?" "About justice, about whether the law always serves it." His face darkened. "The law's justice, Elizabeth. Without it, we're no better than animals. These outlaws, they would have us return to chaos, to the rule of the gun rather than the gavel. But what if the law protects those who don't deserve protection? What if it punishes those who are simply trying to survive?" The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, her father set down his fork with deliberate care. "You've been listening to foolish talk, romantic notions about noble bandits." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "Let me be clear, daughter. These men are killers and thieves. They deserve nothing but the rope, and anyone who aids them, anyone who shows them sympathy, is guilty of treason against civilization itself." That night, Elizabeth stood at her window watching the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere out there, Jake Callahan was riding through darkness, branded a criminal by men like her father. She pressed her hand against the glass, remembering the feel of his face beneath her palm, the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious and powerful all at once. The news came with the first frost. Deputy Marcus Webb burst into the judge's study where Elizabeth was organizing papers. "Judge Whitfield, we've got word on Callahan. He's been spotted near Widow's Peak. Marshal Hayes is gathering a posse." Her father rose like an avenging angel. "How many men?" 20, maybe more. All good shots." "Make it 30. I want him brought in." His smile was cold as winter iron. "Dead or alive? Though dead would be simpler." Elizabeth's hands clenched in her lap, crushing the papers she held. After the men left, she stared at the wrinkled documents. Land deeds, she realized. Property seized for back taxes, sold to wealthy buyers for pennies on the dollar. Legal theft, sanctioned by her father's court. That evening, as her father prepared to join the posse, Elizabeth made her choice. "Father," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest, "what if you're wrong? What if Jake Callahan isn't the monster you believe him to be?" He turned on her, his face flushed with anger. "Jake Callahan, you speak of him with familiarity. I speak of him as I would any human being deserving of fair consideration. He is not human. He is a rabid dog that needs putting down." Her father stepped closer, and for the first time in her life, Elizabeth saw something in his eyes that frightened her. "Do you know something, Elizabeth? Did that criminal approach you?" Of course not. The lie burned her throat. Good. He pulled on his heavy coat, checking the revolver at his hip. Because if I thought for one moment that you had been corrupted by that outlaw, daughter or not, I would see justice done. After he left, Elizabeth sank into a chair, shaking. The house felt like a tomb, silent and suffocating. Outside, she could hear the posse gathering, horses stamping, men shouting, guns being loaded. They would hunt Jake like an animal, run him to ground, and her father would watch him hang with the same dispassion he showed when sentencing old men for stealing bread. Unable to bear it, she fled to her room. But even there she found no peace. The walls seemed to close in, papered with respectability and lies. On her dresser sat a photograph, herself and her father at last year's Founders' Day celebration. She looked at her own face in the picture, searching for any sign of the woman who had kissed an outlaw in a root cellar, who had chosen one wild hour over a lifetime of safety. The wind picked up as night fell, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers. Elizabeth pressed her face against the cold glass, her breath fogging the pain. Somewhere in those dark hills, Jake Callahan was running for his life, while she sat trapped in her tower of propriety, as useless as a china doll. "You've got fire in you," he'd said. "Don't let them put it out." But the fire was drowning in duty and fear, and Elizabeth didn't know how to fan the flames back to life. All she could do was wait and watch and remember, holding tight to that one wild hour like a lifeline in a sea of proper desperation. The stars offered no comfort, only the cold reminder that some distances were too vast to cross, some choices too heavy to unmake. Tomorrow would bring news of capture or escape, of justice served or justice perverted. But tonight, Elizabeth Whitfield sat alone with her memories and her regrets. A judge's daughter who had tasted freedom and found her cage unbearable. The wind howled through the canyon of Main Street, carrying the echoes of hoofbeats and hunting cries, and Elizabeth pressed her hand against her heart, feeling it beat with a rhythm that whispered a name she dared not speak aloud. Jake, Jake, Jake. 5 years had carved their passage into Cedar Ridge like water through stone, leaving everything changed yet somehow unchanged. Elizabeth Whitfield sat in the parlor of the house that had become her inheritance and her prison, her hands folded over correspondence she no longer cared to read. At 28, she had evolved into exactly what the town expected: a pillar of propriety, a model of feminine virtue, a spinster who hosted charity drives and taught Sunday school with unwavering dedication. The townspeople spoke of her with mingled respect and pity. Poor Elizabeth, they whispered, still unmarried despite her beauty, still devoted to her father's memory. They didn't know that she had refused 3 proposals in those 5 years, each from men her father would have deemed perfect: a banker from Denver, a cattle baron's son, even a federal judge who promised her a life of comfort in San Francisco. She had smiled and declined with such grace that each man left believing he had been gently honored rather than firmly rejected. Judge Samuel Whitfield had been dead for 2 years now, felled by his own heart during a particularly vehement closing argument. He had died as he lived, demanding justice, or at least his version of it. Elizabeth had stood at his graveside in proper black, accepting condolences while feeling nothing but a hollow ache where grief should have been. The town had mourned a great man. She had buried a tyrant who happened to be her father. His successor, Judge Franklin Morris, was cut from the same cloth but with sharper scissors. Where her father had been rigid, Morris was cruel. Where her father had seen the law as sacred duty, Morris saw it as a tool for profit under his rule. Cedar Ridge had grown prosperous for some and desperate for many. The gallows saw frequent use, and the cemetery's Potter's Field expanded monthly with the bodies of those who had dared challenge the established order. Elizabeth moved through her days like an actress in a long-running play, speaking her lines with perfect diction while her mind wandered to forbidden territories. She poured tea at social gatherings, discussing the weather and the shocking price of silk, while inside she remembered rough hands and a voice that spoke of freedom. At night, she would stand at the same window where she had first seen him, watching the stars and wondering if Jake Callahan watched them too, or if he lay beneath 6 feet of earth in some unmarked grave. The stories hadn't stopped. If anything, they had grown with the telling. The Callahan gang had become legend throughout the territory, Robin Hoods of the desert, phantoms of justice who struck at the corrupt and disappeared like smoke. Some claimed Jake had been killed in a shootout in Tucson. Others swore they'd seen him as far north as Montana. But the stories that made Elizabeth's heart race were the ones that placed him still in the territory, still fighting, still free. She had become an expert at hiding her reactions when his name arose in conversation. When Margaret Hayes mentioned at tea that her husband had received new wanted posters with increased bounties, Elizabeth's hand never trembled as she passed the sugar. When young Tommy Morrison breathlessly recounted rumors of a midnight raid on the Copper King Mine Company, she managed appropriate disapproval while her pulse hammered with forbidden pride. The town itself had transformed around her. New buildings rose along Main Street, a bank with marble columns, a hotel that boasted hot running water, shops selling goods from as far away as Paris. The railroad had finally come through, bringing prosperity and strangers in equal measure. But beneath the veneer of civilization, Elizabeth saw the rot. She saw it in the families evicted from their homes for missing a single payment. She saw it in the chain gangs building roads under the desert sun, men convicted of petty crimes laboring unto death. She saw it in Judge Morris's new mansion on the hill, built with money that should have gone to the town treasury. "You're wool gathering again, Miss Elizabeth." The voice startled her from her reverie. Mrs. Clara Hutchins, the housekeeper who had served the Whitfield family for 20 years, stood in the doorway with knowing eyes. "I'm sorry, Clara, I was just thinking about the church bazaar next week." Clara's expression suggested she wasn't fooled. "You think too much. If you don't mind my saying, a woman your age should be thinking about other things. Family, children. Perhaps you're right." Elizabeth rose, smoothing her skirts. "I think I'll take a walk. The evening air might clear my head." Outside, Cedar Ridge buzzed with early evening activity. The saloons were beginning their nightly chorus, piano music spilling into the street along with laughter and arguments. Elizabeth walked past it all, nodding to those who greeted her, maintaining the perfect facade of the judge's daughter, even though the judge was dead and she was no longer anyone's daughter but her own. She found herself, as she often did, at the cemetery. Her father's grave stood monument tall, proclaiming his virtues in carved granite. She stared at it, wondering what virtues those had truly been. Order? Certainly. Justice? That depended on who was asked. He wasn't all bad, you know. Elizabeth spun around, her hand flying to her throat. A woman stood among the headstones, older, weathered by sun and hardship, but with eyes that held surprising warmth. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said. "I didn't hear you approach. People rarely do." The woman smiled, revealing gaps between her teeth. "I'm Maria Delgado. I clean the church." The name was familiar. Elizabeth had seen her around town, but they'd never spoken. Proper ladies didn't converse with Mexican cleaning women. "Your father," Maria continued, approaching the grave. "He sentenced my husband to 5 years hard labor. Theft, they called it, though all Miguel did was take back wages owed to him." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. "I'm sorry. Don't be. Your father could have given him 10 years, could have had him hanged. Others would have." Maria touched the gravestone with surprising gentleness. He was a hard man, but he had moments of mercy, small ones, but they mattered. They stood in silence for a moment, two women from different worlds united by complicated grief. "I remember you," Maria said suddenly. 5 years ago, the night of the great storm." Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you mean." "I was walking home late from the church. I saw you leave the carriage house." Maria's eyes held no judgment, only understanding. "Saw you go in empty and come out changed, like my Miguel after his first child was born. Same face, but different soul." "Please," Elizabeth whispered. "You can't tell anyone." "Tell what?" That the perfect judge's daughter has a heart that beats like everyone else's? Maria shook her head. Your secret is safe, Nina, but secrets have weight. They change the shape of a life. As if conjured by the conversation, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming rain. Elizabeth shivered, though the evening was warm. He's coming back, you know. Maria's voice was soft as moth wings. The one who rides with justice. The signs are there for those who know how to read them. The powerful grow too bold, too cruel. They forget that the desert has its own laws, older than any judge's ruling. You're speaking of rumors, ghost stories. Am I? Maria smiled that gap-toothed smile again. Maybe, or maybe I'm speaking of the man whose name you whisper in your sleep when you think no one can hear. Elizabeth's face burned. Had she been so transparent? But Maria was already walking away, disappearing among the headstones like a spirit herself. That night, sleep eluded Elizabeth entirely. She paced her room, Maria's words echoing in her mind. He's coming back. The powerful grow too bold. The desert has its own laws. Outside her window, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising the kind of weather that could change everything, wash away the old and usher in the new. She thought of the woman she had become, respected, admired, utterly alone. She thought of the girl she had been, pressing her lips to an outlaw's in a root cellar while the world howled above. That girl had believed in possibilities, in choices that mattered, in love that could defy convention. This woman knew better. This woman understood that some cages were built from the inside out, bar by bar, choice by careful choice, until escape became impossible. But as lightning began to flicker in the distance and the first drops of rain struck her window, Elizabeth felt something stir in her chest. That old fire Jake had recognized, banked but not extinguished. For 5 years she had been the perfect daughter, the perfect citizen, the perfect example of feminine propriety. She had buried her father and inherited his reputation. She had turned down suitable suitors and devoted herself to good works. And she had been dying, slowly but surely, one proper day at a time. The storm was coming. Maria had seen the signs, and now Elizabeth saw them too. Not just in the gathering clouds, but in the tension that gripped Cedar Ridge, in the whispers of rebellion among the poor, in the increasingly harsh measures Judge Morris employed to maintain order. The town was a powder keg, and somewhere out in the desert, a lit match was riding closer. He's coming back. This time, it was her own voice speaking the words, soft but certain. Elizabeth pressed her palm against the window, feeling the glass tremble with thunder, and made a decision that would have horrified the woman she'd pretended to be. When Jake Callahan returned, and she knew with bone-deep certainty that he would, she would be ready. Not the frightened girl who had let him ride away alone, but a woman who had learned the price of safety and found it too high to pay. The storm broke in earnest, rain lashing against the house, wind howling through the streets like a living thing, and Elizabeth Whitfield stood at her window, no longer watching but waiting, her reflection in the glass showing someone she almost recognized, someone with fire in her eyes and steel in her spine, someone who might just be brave enough to choose love over law when the moment came. 5 years was a long time to wait, but some things, some people, were worth waiting for. And as the lightning split the sky and thunder shook the foundations of Cedar Ridge, Elizabeth smiled for the first time in years, tasting rain on the wind and revolution in the air. The storm that had been building for days finally broke over Cedar Ridge with biblical fury. Lightning turned the night to fractured day. Thunder shook the buildings to their foundations, and rain fell in sheets that turned Main Street into a muddy river. It was the kind of storm that kept decent folks indoors and gave cover to those who moved in shadows. The kind of storm that had brought Jake Callahan to her once before. Elizabeth stood in the darkness of her father's study, now hers, watching the chaos outside. She had dismissed Clara hours ago, claiming a headache, needing to be alone with the premonition that crawled beneath her skin like electricity. Every nerve sang with awareness. Every breath came sharp with anticipation. She knew, with the same certainty that birds knew to fly south, that tonight would change everything. The first indication came as a break in the thunder, hoofbeats, fast and purposeful, cutting through the storm's cacophony. Then shouts, muffled by rain but urgent. Elizabeth moved to the window, peering through the water-streaked glass. Figures on horseback materialized from the downpour, their shapes distorted but their intent clear. They were riding hard, riding desperate, riding like men with hell on their heels. One figure broke from the group, guiding his mount down the alley beside her house with the sureness of memory. Elizabeth's heart stopped, then resumed with painful force. She knew that silhouette, knew the way he sat his horse, knew the angle of his hat against the rain. 5 years dissolved like sugar in water, leaving only the raw truth of recognition. She was at the back door before conscious thought could stop her, throwing it open to the storm. Rain soaked through her dress immediately, plastering the fabric to her skin, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the man dismounting in the shadows of the carriage house, moving with the careful precision of someone hurt but unwilling to show weakness. "Jake," he spun at her voice, hand moving to his gun, then froze, for a heartbeat that lasted forever. They stared at each other across 5 years and a lifetime of change. The boy she had known was gone, replaced by a man carved lean by hardship, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes holding depths of experience that made her chest ache. But when he spoke, his voice was exactly as she remembered, rough velvet and smoke. "Elizabeth, you shouldn't be out here. Neither should you." She stepped into the rain, not caring that she was ruining her dress, her reputation, everything proper ladies held dear. "You're hurt." In the lightning's stark illumination, she saw the truth of it, blood seeping through his shirt, his left arm held tight against his body, the careful way he breathed that spoke of ribs either broken or bruised. "It's nothing I haven't dealt with before." "Don't!" The word came out sharper than intended. "Don't pretend with me. Not after—" She stopped, unable to finish. "Not after you kissed me and left me to die slowly in this place. Not after 5 years of dreams and regrets." Something shifted in his expression, a softening that made him look younger, more like the man who had painted word pictures of freedom in a root cellar. "No," he agreed quietly. "Not with you." More shouts echoed from the street. Jake's hand tightened on his gun. "They'll search house by house. Judge Morris has half the territory looking for me." "Then come inside." When he hesitated, she stepped closer, rain streaming down her face like tears. "Please, Jake, let me help you. You know what you're risking? I've been risking it for 5 years, every time I said no to a suitor, every time I stood at that window and remembered. The only difference now is that the risk has a purpose." He studied her face in the intermittent lightning, and whatever he saw there decided him. With a nod, he followed her into the house, leaving muddy boot prints on floors that had never known such scandal. In the kitchen, Elizabeth lit a single lamp, keeping the flame low. In its gentle light, Jake's condition became clearer and worse, beyond the obvious wound in his side. He bore the marks of hard riding and harder fighting, a cut along his cheekbone, knuckles split and swollen, the kind of exhaustion that came from being hunted too long. "Sit," she commanded, surprising herself with her steady voice. "I need to look at that wound. Elizabeth, sit." He sat, a wry smile touching his lips. "You've changed. We've both changed." She gathered supplies, her father's whiskey, clean cloth, a needle and thread from her sewing basket. "The boy who kissed me in a root cellar wouldn't have come back to Cedar Ridge. Too dangerous, too foolish." "Maybe I am foolish," he hissed as she helped him remove his shirt, revealing the bullet graze along his ribs. "Not fatal, but deep enough to need attention. Or maybe I had a reason." She focused on cleaning the wound, trying not to notice the play of lamplight over scarred muscle, the heat of his skin under her fingers. "The stories say you've been busy. Judge Morris calls you the territory's most wanted man." "Judge Morris." Jake's voice hardened. "He makes your father look like a saint. Do you know what he's done? The families he's destroyed? The land he's stolen using legal tricks and forged documents? I know. She threaded the needle, proud that her hands remained steady. I've watched it happen, watched him twist the law into a weapon, and done nothing. The accusation stung because it was true. She had done nothing but watch and wait and slowly suffocate in propriety. I'm the judge's daughter. What power did I have? You had knowledge. You had position. You had... He broke off as she began stitching, his jaw tightening against the pain. I had fear. She finished quietly. Fear of ending up like the others who opposed him. Fear of losing the only life I knew. Fear that you were dead and nothing I did would matter anyway. Silence fell between them, broken only by the storm outside and the whisper of thread through flesh. When she finished, she wrapped the wound carefully, her fingers lingering perhaps longer than necessary. "Why did you come back?" she asked finally. "The real reason." Jake caught her hand, holding it against his chest where his heart beat strong and steady. "Because Judge Morris made a mistake. He took something that didn't belong to him, land that was promised to the Delgado family, good people who've worked it for generations. When they protested, he had Miguel Delgado arrested on false charges, the man scheduled to hang tomorrow. Maria's husband." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "She spoke to me yesterday, said the signs were there, that you were coming. Maria sees things others miss." His thumb traced circles on her palm, setting her nerves afire. "My men are creating distractions all over town, drawing Morris's forces away, but I need something from his office. Documents that prove the land grab was illegal. Proof that even he can't ignore or bury." "You're going to break into the courthouse? That's suicide. They'll have guards. I've done harder things." He released her hand, reaching for his shirt. "I should go. I've already put you in enough danger." "No!" The word emerged with surprising force. "You're exhausted, wounded, and the storm is getting worse. You'll stay here tonight. Rest. Plan." When he started to protest, she continued. "And I'm going with you." "Absolutely not. You need someone who knows the courthouse layout, who knows where Morris keeps his private files. I've been there hundreds of times. I know every room, every locked cabinet." She met his shocked gaze steadily. "You're not the only one who's learned to move in shadows. Jake Callahan. The difference is my shadows wore silk and served tea. Elizabeth, if we're caught, then I'll hang beside you." The words should have terrified her. Instead, they felt like freedom. "I've been dead for 5 years anyway. At least this way. My death might mean something." He stood slowly, favoring his injured side, and crossed to where she stood. His hands cupped her face with the same gentleness she remembered, his eyes searching hers. "The girl I knew wouldn't have talked about death so easily. The girl you knew died the morning you left." She covered his hands with hers. "But maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe she needed to die so someone stronger could be born." "You were always strong. I saw it that night, the fire in you struggling against the cage." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "I've thought about you every day. Wondered if you hated me for leaving." "I hated myself for letting you go alone." The confession emerged raw, scraped from depths she'd kept sealed, for being too afraid to choose you over everything else. And now I know that some choices come back around. If we're lucky, that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about acting despite the fear. She turned her face into his palm, pressing her lips to the scarred skin. "I won't waste this second chance." He kissed her then, and it was nothing like their first kiss. That had been desperation and discovery. This was deliberate, a claiming and a promise, tinged with the knowledge of what they risked and what they might gain. Elizabeth melted into him, her hands finding the solid warmth of his chest, feeling his heart race to match hers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, the world had shifted on its axis. "Tomorrow night," Jake said roughly. "After full dark, the storm should provide cover. I know another way in, through the old jail tunnels. They connect to the courthouse basement." She smoothed his shirt where her hands had wrinkled it. "No one uses them anymore." "How do you know about them?" A sad smile touched her lips. Because I've spent 5 years learning everything about this town's secrets. Knowledge was the only power I had, even if I was too afraid to use it. Until now. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the kitchen, a different kind of electricity crackled. They stood close enough to share breath, to share warmth, to share the weight of what they planned. "You should rest," Elizabeth said finally. "Take my father's room. The bed is made, and no one will think to look there." "Where will you sleep?" "I won't." She moved to douse the lamp. "Someone needs to keep watch, and I have preparations to make." In the darkness, she felt him catch her hand once more. "Elizabeth, are you certain? Once we do this, there's no going back. You'll be branded an outlaw, same as me." She squeezed his fingers, drawing strength from his touch. "Then we'll be outlaws together. At least that's an honest living." His soft laugh followed her from the room, warming her more than any fire, as she settled by the front window to watch the storm and the street beyond. Elizabeth felt more alive than she had in years. Tomorrow would bring danger, possibly death, but tonight she had chosen. Not the safe path, not the proper path, but the right path. And for the first time in 5 years, the woman in the window's reflection smiled back at her with fierce, wild joy. Dawn came like a reluctant witness, pale and hesitant through the storm-washed sky. Elizabeth hadn't slept, but she felt more awake than she had in years. She'd spent the night planning, gathering supplies, and burning certain documents from her father's files, records that showed his own compliance with corruption, evidence she'd kept out of some misguided loyalty to a dead man's reputation. Jake emerged from her father's room moving stiffly but with better color than the night before. In daylight, she could see the changes 5 years had wrought more clearly, lines etched by sun and hardship, a scar across his collarbone that hadn't been there before, the watchful tension of a man who'd learned to sleep with one eye open. "Any trouble?" he asked, accepting the coffee she offered. "Marshal Hayes came by around 3, checking houses. I told him I'd been ill, hadn't seen anything." She sat across from him at the kitchen table, the domestic normalcy of the scene at odds with what they planned. "He believed me. The judge's daughter is above suspicion. Not after tonight." "No," she agreed. "Not after tonight." They spent the morning in careful preparation. Elizabeth drew detailed maps of the courthouse interior, marking guard positions and the location of Morris's private office. Jake cleaned his weapons with methodical precision, his movements economical and practiced. They worked in companionable silence, 2 people preparing for war with the quiet efficiency of those who understood the stakes. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the town began buzzing with news. The Wallace gang, Jake's men, had struck 3 different targets overnight. The mining company's payroll office, empty but for IOUs to workers. The land registry, where several suspicious deeds had mysteriously disappeared. And the territorial prison, where a hole had been blown in the outer wall, allowing a dozen men to escape, men imprisoned for debts, vagrancy, and other crimes of poverty. "Judge Morris is furious," Elizabeth reported, returning from a carefully casual walk through town. "He's called in federal marshals, posted rewards that would make a man rich for life. The whole territory is looking for you." Jake smiled grimly. "Good. Let them look everywhere but here." As darkness fell, Elizabeth changed into clothes she'd hidden years ago, men's trousers and shirt, purchased in secret and never worn, remnants of a rebellion she'd been too afraid to pursue. The fabric felt strange against her skin, but when she looked in the mirror, she saw someone she recognized. Not the judge's proper daughter, but the woman who'd chosen one wild hour and was finally ready to claim the rest. "You look like trouble," Jake said when she emerged, appreciation warming his eyes. "I am trouble. I've just been hiding it under petticoats and propriety." They left through the cellar as the last light faded, following the same route Jake had taken 5 years before. The tunnel was as Elizabeth remembered, damp, narrow, filled with the echoes of their breathing. But this time she wasn't showing him the way out. They were going deeper, toward the heart of Cedar Ridge's corruption. The old jail tunnels were worse, partially collapsed in places, thick with spider webs and the musty smell of long abandonment. Elizabeth led with confident steps, her lamp throwing wild shadows on the earthen walls. Behind her, Jake moved silent as a ghost, his presence both comforting and thrilling. These tunnels connect to the courthouse? My grandfather had them built during the Apache Wars, she explained, ducking under a low beam. Emergency escape routes. Father showed them to me when I was young, before he decided daughters shouldn't know such things. They emerged in the courthouse basement through a rusted grate that screamed protest when moved. Above, the building was quiet. Most of the guards were out hunting Jake's gang, leaving only a skeleton crew. Elizabeth's heart hammered as they crept up the stairs, every creak of old wood sounding loud as gunshots. The first guard they encountered was dozing at his post. Jake's hand over his mouth and a quick pressure point application sent him into deeper sleep. They bound and gagged him, then moved on. The second guard posed more difficulty. Young, alert, pacing the hallway near Morris's office. Elizabeth stepped out before Jake could stop her. "Deputy Carson," she said, affecting surprise. "What are you doing here so late?" The young man straightened, touching his hat. "Miss Whitfield, I could ask you the same. It's not safe. What were those outlaws about?" Jake's gun butt caught him behind the ear. He dropped like a felled tree. Elizabeth caught him, lowering him gently to the floor. "That was reckless." Jake whispered, "That was necessary. Morris's office is right there." The lock on Morris's door was substantial, but Jake produced tools from his pocket and worked with the skill of long practice. Within minutes, they were inside the sanctuary of corruption, a lavish office that reeked of cigar smoke and greed. "Check the desk," Jake instructed, moving to the file cabinets. "Look for anything about land transfers, especially involving Mexican families." They worked quickly, efficiently, the urgency of their task overriding everything else. Elizabeth found what they needed in a hidden drawer: deeds, contracts, correspondence that painted a picture of systematic theft dressed in legal language. The Delgado land was just the latest in a long pattern of seizures, forgeries, and forced sales. "This is it," she breathed. "This proves everything." "Not everything." Jake held up another document. "This is a transfer order for territorial funds. Morris has been skimming from public coffers for years. Your father's name is on some of these." Elizabeth's stomach turned, but she wasn't surprised. "Then let his reputation burn with Morris's. The truth matters more than protecting a dead man's legacy." Shouts erupted from somewhere in the building. Their time was up. "The window," Jake said, but Elizabeth shook her head. "They'll expect that. Back to the tunnels." They ran through darkened hallways, documents clutched tight, as the courthouse came alive with searching men. A shot rang out, shattering a window near Elizabeth's head. Jake spun, returning fire, driving their pursuers back. The basement stairs appeared ahead, but so did Marshal Hayes, his gun drawn and face grim. "That's far enough. Callahan, Miss Whitfield, step away from him." "No." Elizabeth moved closer to Jake, her chin raised in defiance. "I'm with him by choice. Marshal, arrest me too, if you must." Hayes's face showed genuine pain. "Your father was my friend. Elizabeth, this would break his heart." "My father's heart was broken long before this. He just hid it under law books and verdicts." She pulled out the documents. "Do you want to know what your friend did, Marshal? What Morris is doing? Or do you want to keep pretending the law in Cedar Ridge serves justice?" For a long moment, they stood frozen, Elizabeth and Jake facing down the marshal's gun, the weight of truth heavy between them. Then more shouts echoed from above, and Hayes made his choice. "The tunnel grate is to your left," he said quietly. "I'll be exactly 1 minute behind you." Elizabeth felt Jake's surprise match her own, but they didn't waste the gift. They plunged into the tunnels, running through darkness as pursuit thundered behind them. The passages seemed endless, their escape route now a maze of wrong turns and dead ends. "This way," Elizabeth gasped, recognizing a junction. "It leads to the old mine." They emerged into star-filled night just as riders appeared on the ridge above. Jake whistled sharply, and answering whistles came from the darkness. His gang materialized like phantoms, hard men with harder lives. But they looked at Jake with loyalty earned through shared danger and common cause. "Mount up," Jake ordered. "We ride for Mexico." "Wait." Elizabeth caught his arm. "Miguel Delgado. They plan to hang him at dawn." Jake's face was stone in the moonlight. "We have what we came for. Morris is finished once these documents reach the federal authorities." "But that won't save Miguel. Not in time." She saw the war in his eyes, safety against honor, wisdom against righteousness. Then he smiled, wild and free. The outlaw who'd stolen her heart with equal measures of danger and nobility. "Then I guess we're not done yet." He lifted her onto his horse, swinging up behind her. "Think you can handle one more wild hour, Miss Whitfield?" Elizabeth leaned back against him, feeling his heartbeat strong against her spine. "I think I can handle a lifetime of them, Mr. Callahan." They rode hard through the desert night, a band of outlaws and one reformed lady, racing toward dawn and whatever justice they could carve from an unjust world. Behind them, Cedar Ridge erupted in chaos. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and freedom. But wrapped in Jake's arms as they thundered through the darkness, Elizabeth felt only wild joy. She had chosen love over law, truth over safety, the uncertain path over the prescribed one. Whatever came next, pursuit, capture, or escape, she would face it as herself, finally and completely free. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient witnesses to their flight, as the woman who had lived one wild hour rode toward a lifetime of them, leaving behind nothing but dust and the echo of hoofbeats in the desert wind. The desert stretched before them like an ocean of sand and stone, painted silver by moonlight and shadow. They rode through the night, pushing their horses as hard as they dared, knowing that dawn would bring both Miguel Delgado's execution and their own likely capture if they failed. Elizabeth had never ridden so hard or so fast, her body aching with the unfamiliar strain. But she wouldn't have traded places with anyone in the world. "There," Jake pointed to a cluster of lights in the distance. "Ridgeway Station. That's where they're holding Miguel before transport back to Cedar Ridge for the hanging." The gang reined in their horses on a rise overlooking the small way station. It was a fortified compound, built to withstand Apache raids, now serving as a temporary jail for prisoners in transit. Elizabeth counted at least 6 guards visible in the lamplight. And there would be more inside. "Tom, take Rodriguez and circle around back," Jake ordered quietly. "Wait for my signal. Ben, you and the others create a distraction at the main gate. Make them think the whole gang is attacking from the front." "What about us?" Elizabeth asked. Jake's smile was grim in the moonlight. "We're going in through the roof." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. While Jake's men drew fire and attention at the front gates, Jake and Elizabeth scaled the back wall using ropes and determination. The adobe was rough enough to provide handholds, but Elizabeth's hands were bleeding by the time they reached the flat roof. Below, gunfire erupted as the distraction began in earnest. "You could have stayed with the horses," Jake whispered as they crept across the roof. "And miss all the fun?" She was terrified, exhilarated, more alive than she'd ever been. "Besides, you need someone to watch your back." They found the roof access, a simple wooden hatch that Jake pried open with his knife. The drop into the building was farther than expected, but Elizabeth landed in a crouch, her body remembering gymnastics lessons from childhood that her father had deemed unladylike and discontinued. The interior was chaos. Guards ran toward the front of the building, shouting orders and curses. Jake and Elizabeth moved in the opposite direction, searching for the cells. They found them in the back. 3 iron cages, 2 empty, one containing a beaten but defiant Miguel Delgado. "Jake," Miguel's eyes widened in surprise, "and Miss Whitfield." "No time for explanations." Jake shot the lock off the cell door. "Can you ride?" "I can fly if it means getting out of here." They retraced their steps, but a guard appeared in the hallway, his rifle rising. Elizabeth acted without thinking. Throwing her knife, another skill from those discontinued lessons. It caught the guard in the shoulder, spinning him around. Jake finished the job with a quick strike that sent the man crumpling. "Where did you learn to throw like that?" Jake demanded as they ran. "Same place I learned to ride astride and pick locks, from books my father didn't know I was reading." They burst out the back door to find Tom and Rodriguez with horses ready. The front of the compound was a battlefield, muzzle flashes lighting the night like deadly fireflies. Jake whistled sharply, the signal to withdraw, and his men began their retreat, laying down covering fire as they backed away. They rode hard into the desert, scattering into smaller groups to confuse pursuit. Jake led Elizabeth and Miguel through a maze of canyons he seemed to know by heart, finally stopping at a hidden spring as the eastern sky began to lighten. "Maria will be overjoyed," Miguel said, drinking deeply from the spring. "She never doubted you would come." "Thank Miss Whitfield," Jake corrected. "She reminded me that some things matter more than safety." Miguel looked at Elizabeth with new respect. "The judge's daughter rides with outlaws now?" "The judge is dead," Elizabeth said simply, "and his daughter died with him. I'm just Elizabeth now." As the sun rose, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, they pressed on. Jake led them to a camp hidden deep in the canyon lands, a collection of tents and lean-tos that housed not just his gang, but their families. Women emerged to greet them. Children ran alongside the horses, and Elizabeth saw that this wasn't just a gang of outlaws. It was a community of the displaced, the dispossessed, those whom the law had failed or actively persecuted. "Welcome to Freedom Canyon," Jake said, helping her dismount. "It's not much, but it's home." Over the next days, Elizabeth learned the truth behind the legend of the Callahan gang. They were outlaws, yes, but also protectors of those who had no other protection. The money they stole went to feed families, buy medicine, help people start new lives beyond the reach of corrupt judges and bought lawmen. Jake ran the camp with the same natural leadership he'd shown that night in the root cellar. Firm but fair, earning loyalty through respect rather than fear. But they couldn't stay hidden forever. Word came that Judge Morris had put a $1,000 bounty on Jake's head and $500 on Elizabeth's, labeled as kidnapped, rather than admitting the judge's daughter had chosen her own path. Federal marshals were coming, along with hired guns and bounty hunters drawn by the promise of wealth. "We need to get those documents to someone who can use them," Jake said one evening as they sat by the campfire. "Someone with power to act against Morris." "I know someone," Elizabeth said slowly. "Judge Theodore Fleming in Santa Fe. He was my father's rival, but he's honest. He always suspected corruption in Cedar Ridge, but could never prove it." Santa Fe is 3 days' ride through hostile territory. Morris will have men watching every route. Then we go where they won't expect, through Devil's Backbone. Jake's eyebrows rose. Devil's Backbone was a treacherous route through the mountains, barely passable in good weather, deadly in bad. But it would cut a day off their journey and avoid the main trails. They left at dawn with a small group: Jake, Elizabeth, Tom Wallace, and Ben Carter. The documents were split between them. Insurance against total loss. The first day's ride was hard but uneventful, following deer trails and dry washes. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, the terrain became brutal. The path narrowed until they had to dismount and lead the horses. On one side rose sheer cliff walls. On the other, drops of hundreds of feet. The wind howled through the passes, threatening to tear them from the narrow ledge. Elizabeth's fear of heights warred with her determination, and determination won. Step by careful step. "You're doing fine," Jake encouraged, his hand finding hers when the path allowed them to walk side by side. "Bravest woman I've ever known." Brave or foolish? Is there a difference? They camped that night in a cave, exhausted but alive. As the others slept, Elizabeth sat with Jake at the cave mouth, watching stars wheel overhead. The vastness of the sky made their problems seem both smaller and more significant. They were tiny figures in an enormous world. But their choices mattered, rippling outward like stones thrown in still water. "Do you regret it?" Jake asked quietly. Giving up your life in Cedar Ridge? Elizabeth considered the question seriously. I regret that it took me so long to choose. 5 years of waiting, of being afraid. She turned to face him. But I don't regret this, not for a moment. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a promise rather than a passion. When they pulled apart, his eyes held something she'd never seen before, hope for a future beyond running and fighting. The second day brought new challenges. A rattlesnake spooked Ben's horse, nearly sending both over the edge before Tom's quick rope work saved them. Then came rain, turning the narrow path treacherous with mud. They pressed on, knowing that delay meant death as surely as falling. As they descended toward the valley that led to Santa Fe, riders appeared on their back trail, Morris's men, having somehow discovered their route. Gunfire echoed off the canyon walls as they rode hard for cover, bullets whining past like angry hornets. "The bridge!" Tom shouted, pointing ahead to where a rope bridge spanned a deep gorge. "We cross and cut it. They can't follow." It was their only chance. They thundered toward the bridge, their pursuers gaining ground. Jake and Elizabeth reached it first, their horses' hooves drumming on the wooden planks. Tom was halfway across when a bullet caught him, spinning him from his saddle. Ben tried to grab him but missed, and Tom Wallace fell, his body disappearing into the mist below. "No!" Jake's anguish tore through the air, but there was no time to mourn. They cut the bridge supports just as Morris's men reached the edge, stranding them on the far side. They rode in grim silence the rest of the way to Santa Fe, the joy of escape poisoned by loss. Tom had been Jake's oldest friend, his most trusted lieutenant. His death was a reminder that their fight against corruption came with a blood price. But they had the documents. And Judge Fleming proved to be everything Elizabeth had hoped, sharp, righteous, and hungry for the evidence they provided. Within hours, he had issued warrants for Morris's arrest, dispatched federal investigators to Cedar Ridge, and begun the process of overturning wrongful convictions. This is just the beginning. Fleming warned them. Morris has powerful friends. They'll fight back. Then we'll keep fighting, Jake said simply. For Tom, for everyone Morris destroyed. As they left Fleming's office, Elizabeth slipped her hand into Jake's. They were still outlaws, still hunted, but they had struck a blow for justice that would echo through the territory. And they had each other, no longer the judge's daughter and the outlaw, but partners in truth, bound by choice and consecrated by sacrifice. The sun was setting over Santa Fe, painting the adobe buildings golden red. Somewhere out there, Miguel Delgado was reunited with Maria. Somewhere, corrupt men were learning that their power had limits. And here, in this moment, Elizabeth Whitfield stood free, her wild hours stretched into a lifetime of purpose. "What now?" she asked Jake as they walked toward their horses. "Now we disappear for a while. Let Fleming do his work. Then," he smiled, that wild grin that had first captured her heart. "Then we find the next fight. There's always another town, another corrupt judge, another family needing help. A lifetime of running and fighting. Is that not what you signed up for?" Elizabeth laughed, surprising herself with the joy in it. "It's exactly what I signed up for." They mounted up and rode out of Santa Fe as the first stars appeared. Two outlaws against an unjust world, carrying their grief and their victories equally, ready for whatever battles dawn would bring. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge had never seen such a crowd. People filled every bench, lined the walls, and spilled out onto the street where enterprising vendors sold lemonade to those waiting in the desert heat. It had been 3 months since Jake and Elizabeth delivered the documents to Judge Fleming. 3 months of investigations, arrests, and revelations that had shaken the territory to its foundations. Now came the reckoning. Elizabeth sat in the witness chair, her back straight, her voice clear as she testified. She wore a simple blue dress, no longer the elaborate gowns of the judge's daughter, but something practical, honest. The federal prosecutor, a sharp man named Harrison from Washington, guided her through her testimony with careful questions. "Miss Whitfield, can you identify these documents?" Yes, these are from my father's private files, showing his involvement in illegal land transfers dating back 15 years. A murmur ran through the crowd. Even now, speaking ill of the dead Judge Whitfield was considered shocking. But Elizabeth had moved beyond such concerns. The truth mattered more than reputation. In the defendant's box sat Judge Morris, no longer the imposing figure who had ruled Cedar Ridge with an iron fist. Prison had diminished him, turned his commanding presence into something furtive and desperate. Beside him sat 3 territorial officials, a bank president, and several prominent businessmen, the entire corrupt structure that had bled Cedar Ridge dry for decades. "And how did you come to possess these documents?" Harrison continued. "I took them from Judge Morris's office, along with Jake Callahan. The same Jake Callahan branded an outlaw by the defendant? The same Jake Callahan who risked his life to expose corruption when the law itself had been corrupted." Elizabeth's eyes found Jake in the gallery, where he sat between 2 federal marshals. He was technically still under arrest, though Fleming had promised leniency in exchange for his testimony. He's more lawman than anyone who served under Morris. Morris's lawyer, a slick man imported from San Francisco, rose to cross-examine. "Miss Whitfield, isn't it true that you were romantically involved with the outlaw Callahan? That you ran away with him, abandoning your duty to your community?" "I fell in love with an honest man who happened to be outside the law because the law had failed," Elizabeth replied calmly. "As for duty, I believe exposing corruption and saving innocent lives is a higher duty than hosting tea parties and pretending not to see injustice." The crowd stirred appreciatively. Many of them had suffered under Morris's rule, families torn apart, land stolen, loved ones imprisoned or worse. They had come to see justice done, and Elizabeth's words rang true. The prosecutor called Jake next. He took the stand with the same quiet confidence he'd shown facing down armed men. His testimony was damning. Names, dates, places, a methodical accounting of Morris's crimes. He spoke of the murdered witnesses, the forged documents, the families driven from their homes. "You admit to robbing banks in stages?" Morris's lawyer pressed during cross-examination. "I admit to recovering stolen money and returning it to those it was stolen from." Jake corrected. "Every dollar we took can be accounted for. Medical supplies for the poor, food for the hungry, funds to help families start over after Morris destroyed their lives." "You're asking this court to believe you're some kind of noble thief?" Jake's smile was sharp. "I'm asking this court to recognize the difference between legal and right. Everything Morris did was legal. He made sure of that. But it wasn't right. Sometimes the law needs outlaws to remind it what justice looks like." The trial continued for days. Witness after witness took the stand. Maria Delgado speaking of her husband's false imprisonment. Ranchers describing forged documents and forced sales. Even Marshall Hayes admitting he'd turned a blind eye to corruption out of misplaced loyalty. The most dramatic moment came when Elizabeth's father's journals were introduced. She had found them hidden in the house, a record of his growing doubts about the system he served. The final entry, dated the night before his death, was a confession. "I have been party to terrible injustices. I see now that my rigid adherence to the law has made me an instrument of oppression. Tomorrow, I will begin making amends." "He never got that tomorrow," Elizabeth said quietly from the gallery. "But maybe this is his amends, finally." Throughout it all, the town watched and listened. Some clung to the old ways, muttering about proper order and the danger of change. But more nodded along with the testimony, recognizing their own stories in the parade of victims. The mythology of noble law and savage outlaw was crumbling, replaced by a more complex truth. When the jury retired to deliberate, Elizabeth found herself standing outside the courthouse where her father had once dispensed his version of justice. Jake stood beside her, the marshals having granted him a moment of freedom. "Whatever happens," she said, "we did the right thing." Tom would be proud. Jake agreed, his voice rough with memory of their fallen friend. The jury took only 3 hours. When they filed back in, their faces were grim but determined. The foreman, old Samuel Martinez, who had lost his ranch to Morris's schemes, stood to deliver the verdict. guilty, on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered, others wept. A few of Morris's supporters shouted protests. But the gavel fell, and justice, real justice, was done. Morris and his conspirators would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison, their stolen wealth redistributed to their victims. But there was still Jake's fate to determine. Judge Fleming called a special session to address the pardons. The courtroom was even more packed, if possible. Elizabeth testified again, as did dozens of others whose lives Jake had saved or improved. Even some former members of Morris's administration spoke in Jake's favor, admitting that the outlaw had shown more mercy than they deserved. Fleming's decision was measured but compassionate. Jake Callahan, you have operated outside the law. That much is undeniable, but you did so in response to a complete breakdown of legal justice. Your actions, while illegal, served a moral purpose that this court cannot ignore. He paused, his eyes moving over the crowd. Therefore, I grant you and your men full pardons for all past actions, conditional upon your commitment to work within the law from this day forward. The cheer that went up could be heard in the next county. Jake stood slowly, disbelief and joy warring on his face. Elizabeth flew from her seat, propriety be damned, and threw herself into his arms right there in the courtroom. Their kiss drew applause and a few scandalized gasps from the more traditional attendees. However, Fleming continued when order was restored. The question remains of how to rebuild law enforcement in Cedar Ridge. The marshal's office is compromised, the structure of authority shattered. His eyes found Jake. Mr. Callahan, would you consider a badge to go with that pardon? Jake's shock was almost comical. You want me to be marshal? Who better to enforce just laws than a man who risked everything to see unjust ones overturned? Of course, you'd need deputies you could trust. Jake looked at his surviving gang members, men who had ridden the outlaw trail but always with honor. Then he looked at Elizabeth, a question in his eyes. She smiled. I think Marshal Callahan has a nice ring to it. The appointment wasn't without controversy. Some citizens couldn't accept an outlaw wearing a badge, but more remembered how Jake had protected them when the law wouldn't, how he'd stolen from the rich to feed the poor, how he'd risked his life for justice when easier paths beckoned. As Elizabeth stood with Jake on the courthouse steps, watching him pin on the marshal's star for the first time, she thought about the strange turns life could take. The judge's daughter and the outlaw had become the marshal and his... What? They weren't married, though she suspected that would come. For now, she was his partner, his conscience, his connection to the community that was learning to trust again. Any regrets? She asked as they walked down Main Street together, his new badge catching the afternoon sun. Only one, Jake admitted. Tom should be here to see this. He always said I'd look good in a badge. The bastard. They paused at the new headstone in the cemetery. Thomas Wallace, Deputy Marshal, fallen in service to justice. It was a fiction and a truth all at once. Tom had died an outlaw, but he'd lived as something more. What about you? Jake asked. From judge's daughter to outlaw's woman to marshal's partner. That's quite a journey. Elizabeth considered, looking out over Cedar Ridge. Her cage turned into her cause. My father spent his life serving the law as he understood it. Maybe this is my way of honoring him, serving justice as I understand it. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of redemption, Marshal Jake Callahan and Elizabeth Whitfield walked back toward town. There would be challenges ahead, rebuilding trust, establishing new systems, facing those who profited from the old corruption. But for now, they had won something precious. The chance to prove that justice and law could be partners rather than enemies. The wild hour had become a wild life, and Elizabeth wouldn't have it any other way. In the end, the outlaw had indeed rewritten the law, not through violence or vengeance, but through truth, sacrifice, and the radical belief that justice belonged to everyone, not just those who could afford it. As they reached the marshal's office, Jake's office now, Elizabeth paused. You know what this means, don't you? What's that? I'm going to have to start hosting tea parties again. The marshal's partner has social obligations." Jake's groan echoed down Main Street, followed by Elizabeth's laughter, wild and free as the desert wind, a sound that promised Cedar Ridge's future would be nothing like its past. Dawn broke over Cedar Ridge like a promise kept, painting the desert in shades of gold and possibility. Elizabeth stood at the window of the marshal's office, their office now, watching the town wake to its new life. 6 months had passed since the trial. 6 months of hard work and harder choices. But the changes were visible everywhere she looked. Where once thugs had lounged outside the saloons, intimidating honest folk, now families walked freely. The old gallows had been torn down, replaced by a schoolhouse where Maria Delgado taught reading to children who would have grown up illiterate under Morris's rule. The cemetery's Potter's Field had seen no new additions. Justice in Cedar Ridge no longer meant death for the crime of poverty. "You're up early," Jake said, entering with 2 cups of coffee. He wore his badge comfortably now, though Elizabeth knew he still sometimes reached for guns that hung in places befitting an outlaw rather than a lawman. "Couldn't sleep." "Today's the day." He set down the cups and wrapped his arms around her from behind, chin resting on her shoulder. "Having second thoughts?" "About marrying a former outlaw turned marshal who still can't remember to file his reports on time? Never." She turned in his embrace, fingering the star on his chest. "Though I do wonder what my father would say. I think Judge Fleming had it right at the trial. Your father was starting to see the truth before he died. Maybe he would have understood that sometimes the law needs to be challenged before it can be upheld." A knock interrupted them. Ben Carter entered, wearing his own deputy's badge with pride. "Marshal, we've got visitors. That federal inspector from Washington. Plus someone else says he needs to speak with you urgent-like." The federal inspector was expected. Periodic reviews to ensure Cedar Ridge's reformation stayed on track. But the other visitor proved to be a surprise. A young man, travel-worn and nervous, clutching a letter. "Marshal Callahan? I'm Peter Morrison from Lonesome Creek, 2 days south. We heard about what you did here, how you cleaned up the corruption. We need help, sir. Our town's being bled dry by a judge who makes Morris look charitable." Jake and Elizabeth exchanged glances. They'd known this day would come. Word of Cedar Ridge's transformation had spread throughout the territory, carried by travelers and traders, growing in the telling until Jake Callahan had become a legend twice over, first as an outlaw, now as the lawman who tamed corruption with justice instead of violence. "Tell me everything," Jake said, gesturing the young man to a chair. The story was depressingly familiar. A judge in league with mining interests, families driven from their lands, men imprisoned or killed for defending what was theirs. But there was hope in Peter Morrison's eyes, hope that if it could be fixed in Cedar Ridge, it could be fixed in Lonesome Creek. "I can't abandon my responsibilities here," Jake said slowly. "But perhaps we can send advisors, help you gather evidence, connect you with honest federal authorities." "We could go," Elizabeth said suddenly. Both men turned to stare at her. "Not permanently," she clarified. "But Jake, you've trained good deputies here. The town is stable. Maybe it's time to share what we've learned." The federal inspector, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "The government has been discussing creating a special commission to investigate corruption in territorial courts. If you were willing, Marshal Callahan, Miss Whitfield, your expertise would be invaluable." Elizabeth saw the war in Jake's eyes, the part of him that had found peace in Cedar Ridge against the part that still heard the cries of the oppressed. She knew which would win. It was the same fire that had driven him to become an outlaw in the first place. Only now it could burn within the law rather than outside it. "After the wedding," he said finally. "I'm not postponing that again." The ceremony took place at sunset, in the desert outside town where the sky stretched endless and free. It wasn't the society wedding Elizabeth might once have imagined. No cathedral, no silk gowns, no prominent guests. Instead, their friends gathered in the place where outlaws had once made camp. Maria and Miguel, Ben and the other deputies, Judge Fleming, who had traveled from Santa Fe to officiate, and dozens of townspeople whose lives had been touched by their courage. Elizabeth wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to allow for riding, a practical touch that made Jake smile. He stood waiting for her in his best suit, the marshal's badge polished bright, looking like everything she'd never known she wanted until that night in a root cellar when a stranger's eyes had promised adventure. "Do you, Elizabeth Whitfield, take this former outlaw, current lawman, and perpetual troublemaker to be your husband?" Fleming asked with a twinkle in his eye. "I do," she said, her voice carrying clear across the desert. "Someone needs to make sure he files his paperwork." The laughter that followed was warm as summer rain. When Fleming pronounced them married, Jake kissed her with the same passion he'd shown in stolen moments, but now blessed by law and witnessed by community. No longer hiding, no longer running, but standing proud in the light of their choices. The celebration lasted long into the night, music and dancing. Stories told around campfires, the joining not just of two people but of all the scattered pieces of Cedar Ridge's redemption. Elizabeth danced with former outlaws and prominent citizens alike, the divisions that had once seemed insurmountable, now fading like morning mist. As the evening wound down, she and Jake found themselves alone on a rise overlooking the celebration. Below them, their friends and neighbors continued the party. But up here, the stars held court in ancient silence. "No regrets?" Jake asked, echoing his question from months before. "Only one," Elizabeth admitted. "I wish we hadn't waited 5 years to find our courage. Maybe we needed those 5 years. You needed to understand the system from the inside. I needed to learn that fighting alone wasn't enough. We became who we needed to be to save not just ourselves, but others." She considered this, finding truth in it. The frightened girl who had kissed an outlaw in desperation could never have testified with such authority. The angry young man who had fled into the night might not have possessed the wisdom to build rather than simply tear down. "So what now? Marshal Callahan? Do we ride off to fight corruption wherever we find it? Now, Mrs. Callahan, we take our wedding night. Tomorrow. We plan. Next week. Maybe we ride to Lonesome Creek. Next month. Perhaps Washington to testify before Congress." He pulled her close, his voice dropping to that rough whisper she loved. "But tonight, we're just Jake and Elizabeth, who chose each other against all odds and won." They made their way back to town as the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky. Their house, the judge's mansion transformed into something warmer, waited for them. But first, Elizabeth insisted on one stop. At her father's grave, she laid her wedding bouquet, desert wildflowers that bloomed despite harsh conditions, beautiful in their resilience. "We did it, Father," she whispered. "Found a way to serve justice that honors both law and conscience. I hope, wherever you are, you understand." The wind stirred the flowers, and for a moment, Elizabeth could almost imagine approval in its whisper. Then Jake's hand found hers, warm and steady and real, and they walked together toward their future. The sun rose fully as they reached their door, painting Cedar Ridge in colors of hope and promise. Behind them lay the long trail from that first wild hour, through separation and sorrow, danger and triumph, to this moment of perfect possibility. Ahead stretched all the untold hours of their life together, wild in their own way with purpose and passion and the endless work of bending the arc of justice. "Welcome home, Mrs. Callahan," Jake said, carrying her over the threshold in a tradition as old as love itself. "Welcome home, Marshal," she replied, and kissed him as the door closed behind them, sealing their private joy as the town they'd saved awakened to another day of freedom. In the years that followed, the legend of Jake and Elizabeth Callahan would grow throughout the territories, the outlaw and the lady who rewrote the law not with bullets, but with bravery, who proved that justice and mercy could walk hand in hand, who chose love over safety and changed the world one corrupt court at a time. But that morning, they were simply two people who had found each other across impossible odds, writing the first page of a story that would inspire generations. The judge's daughter had lived more than one wild hour. She had claimed a wild lifetime, and in doing so, had shown others that they could claim theirs too. And, in the end, that was the greatest justice of all, the proof that every person, no matter how trapped by circumstance, had the power to choose courage over comfort, love over law, and freedom over fear. The outlaw had indeed returned to rewrite the law, but the greatest revision was written in the hearts of those who learned that justice wasn't about perfection, but about the endless, imperfect, beautiful struggle to do right by one another in a world that often made right hard to find. And so they rode into their future, badges bright and hearts free, leaving behind a town transformed and carrying forward the truth that had brought them together, that sometimes the wildest thing you can do is believe in the possibility of justice, and the bravest thing is to love without limits in a world that demands limitations. The desert sang its ancient song of endurance and renewal as Marshal Jake Callahan and Elizabeth Whitfield Callahan began their greatest adventure yet, not as outlaw and judge's daughter, but as partners in the eternal quest to make the law serve love rather than the other way around. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining me on this wild journey through the American frontier. I hope the story of Elizabeth and Jake has touched your heart as it has mine. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening to this tale. Please share in the comments below so we can connect across the miles, just as our heroes connected across the divide of law and liberty. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more stories of courage, romance, and redemption from the untamed territories. Share your thoughts about Elizabeth's transformation and Jake's redemption. Did their love story inspire you? Until we meet again on the dusty trails of imagination, keep riding toward your own wild horizons.